Hi there, I'm Des.
And I'm Tim, and together Des and I head up the men's ministry Momentum Australia.
Momentum has multiple functions, but primarily our aim is to help men to succeed in life, to do life better.
We run a weekly radio show that goes all around Australia where we talk about anything and everything that relates to men.
And we encourage men to do life in community, to do life with other men where we can be accountable, we can be welcome, we can be open and honest about what's happening in our world.
We'd love you to have a look around our website. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find a bunch of resources to help you on your journey and all of our previous episodes and topics.
We thank you for your interest in Momentum Australia, and we hope you enjoyed this video today.
All right. Well, once again, it is Momentum, and a big hello to you from myself and Des. Welcome to the show, by the way. And it's so great to have you tuning in. And we're thrilled that you're going to spend some time with us this week. MomentumAustralia.org, as always, is our website. Love you to have a look around there after the show. Have a good look around and get yourself familiar with, who we are and why we're here. Essentially, a men's show for men, by men. And we're here to help you do just that little bit better. That is our tagline here at Momentum, helping men succeed in life. Des, how are you this week, my friend?
We're really good. Really. Yeah, no, it's great to be here and looking forward to an exciting show today. And just while I'm talking, don't forget, men, our Momentum CARELINE, the new support line we have for men, which is 1-800-000-MEN, that's 636. And the service is provided by our friends at CARELINE Connections. And you can reach out and get help 7 days a week between 9 a.m. and 11 p.m. 1-800-000-MEN.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Des. And we do love that partnership, by the way. Avail yourself of that number too. Des and I talk about this a lot. We need to get connected as men.
Yeah.
Doing life in isolation is dangerous for us and potentially life-threatening too. We mean that with all seriousness. So if you don't feel like you've got someone in your world that you can have a conversation with, reach out to the care line, 1-800-000-MEN, that's 636. We talked last week with Nick Marks from AFC about anxiety. And, some of the stats say that there's as many as 3 million Australians currently living with some form of anxiety. We've come to the consensus that it's probably a lot more than that. But Nick from AAFC, we've got him back on the show because we want to explore this topic in greater detail and some other ways that anxiety can impact our lives, our families, our relationships, and even our workplaces. Nick from AAFC, welcome back, mate. It's great to have you back in Momentum.
Yeah, hi Tim and hi Des, and thank you for having me back to talk about this topic with you. It's good to be back with you guys. Keen to spend this time with you today.
Now, just quickly, if you missed last week's show, it is online at momentumaustralia.org, or if you in the podcast space, just put Momentum Australia into your favorite podcast platform and have perhaps a re-listen to show one after this week's show. But we'll do a quick recap, Nick, before we launch into where we want to go today. And I suppose that is defining anxiety and then how do we define it in our own lives? What are the indicators that we might be struggling with this or suffering from this from time to time? Let's start there.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. I think just recapping on some of that is just thinking that it is something that we all will wrestle with or experience in our lives at some time in an acute way, whether it's concerns over a particular issue in our life. A lot of people at the moment might be feeling some anxiety around their finances or other areas, and it can often be acute and not lasting long or on a particular thing or instance or issue that's come up. And then there's other types that are longer lasting, that where the symptoms, the feelings, our ability to cope and function well, if that lasts for 6 or more months, then we're getting into a different type of anxiety. And we touched on that being like a general anxiety disorder. And then we have this chronic anxiety, which at first blush sounds a little bit more like, well, that would be the one that lasts for 6 months or more. But it's more saying chronic anxiety is around, it's an emotional process of how anxiety moves between people and impacts people within a system. There's 2 or more people or a family or it could be a church, an organization, even a society. And so there's different types of anxiety and how they play. But yeah, for sure, we're all going to experience it one way or another at different times. And it's really prevalent at the moment, particularly after the last few years.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about times and context. And you mentioned in last week's show that the age group of 16 to 24, I think it was, particularly had a spike over the last few years during COVID, which was interesting. I thought that was a really interesting age bracket. The 16 to 24s had a spike in their general sense of anxiety. Obviously, one would think that social media would have a part to play in that spike because we are so connected. We get everything through all of the time. It's breaking news. It's happening now. There's news alerts. There's updates all of the time. I suppose give us a broader overview, you think, Nick, of the times and the context, how much that is playing into society's general level of, I suppose, low-level anxiety that we all carry with us.
Yeah. Gee, we could do a whole podcast on this part, couldn't we? The times and context. I think just at the outset too is that some of the internal sources, if you want to call it that, or my own expectations or personality types are their factors, but they can also be influenced by, and to some degree, we're all products of the times that we're in. And so I think there's an interplay and a reciprocity here between what I might be feeling inside and what's happening outside, and what's happening outside and what I'm feeling inside, and how that interplays. But some of the big ones you mentioned, social media and the advent of that, I think that's a huge one. What I might say at a more macro level is that I think there's a number of elements of how we do life, at least in Western nations, that are in fact not everything. So I'm not being doom gloom here, not being conspiracy theorist or anything like that. I'm just saying I think there's a number of factors, quite a significant number of how we do life these days that is in fact anxiety producing in our cultures. That is how we're doing life is anxiety producing. And so the intentionality required by us as men, our families, organizations, communities, friendships, a greater degree than ever before of intentionality of how do we do life in such a way that is healthy and not just going with the flow of our culture, not just from I don't want to be what my culture tells me to be, but because of the impacts and the damage that our culture can do from an anxiety perspective in our lives. And so I think we need to be very intentional. Some of those big ones are, you mentioned social media, isolation. I think even more so since COVID in terms of isolation. And it highlighted how many people were isolated or living disconnected lives. But I think that's increased. And there's also a good side to that, where I think COVID highlighted that we really need relationships and community. And if we're deprived of it, through whatever means, say COVID and lockdowns, etc., that has very significant impacts on people's lives. So it highlighted, has it changed for the better because of that? I'm not really sure, but it's certainly highlighted the importance of connection and community and meaningful relationships in our lives.
And there's a lot of people now who have gone through that, and they look at it and they say, I don't know how to come out of this. I've lost the skill of interacting with other people, and so that creates anxiety in itself.
It does. And we're living in a complex world now, and very, very interconnected in a lot of ways, but at the same time, there's this disconnection where it seems harder to do community and foster relationships that are meaningful. We know that that's the stuff of life, and that's the richness of life is in our relationships. So I don't know if I have all the answers to this here, but it's certainly highlighting the need for it. And there's a very causal relationship between that disconnection and an increase in anxiety.
Yeah, I remember going through the lockdowns particularly, and I was working in radio in Brisbane at that stage, and we had it was a daily Zoom meeting. And it was, after a while, X number of months of that, I found the Zoom meeting was giving me anxiety. It was such a strange thing to just see the screen and whatever, as opposed to actually, but I don't see, you guys aren't in the station with me. I'm on my own, but yet I see you. It was strange. Anyway, we'll park that. But look, I did want to just quickly ask this, Nick, and then we'll move on to how this is out working. But when we look back, and for myself, I'm trying to, I suppose, think of some key events. I was a child of the 70s, grew up in the 80s. You think back to those sorts of times. Yes, there was things happening around the world, but a couple of key events for me there was the Lockerbie tragedy, where the airliner was brought down in, I think it was the late 80s, over Lockerbie. I remember my parents were here from the UK in 2001 when 9/11 happened, and they were due to go back to the UK about 2 weeks after that. And of course, everything was super, super heightened. Do you think that these key events and things like that, plus, as Des mentioned, news, social media, all of those, do you think that over bigger picture, 2 or 3 decades, we've perhaps started, whether we've been aware of it or not, as a society, because of things that we've been made aware of through the news and the greater impact that the news is having in our lives, we're carrying a low level sense of perhaps fear and therefore anxiety just around some of the things that we've seen on the news. Could this happen to me? Is this going to happen in my city, my town? And then of course, COVID with lack of food and toilet rolls and things like that. Like, do you think that these things are adding up where most of us are just generically carrying some degree of low level stress or anxiety?
Yeah. I'm thinking about your question now. That's a great question. There's a lot in that. Thank you for asking it. I think the answer is yes, and I want to come at from a systems perspective, is because we can think of it, we're carrying that individually. Yes, absolutely. And big events can have that, and especially if they compound and they have a term these days, what they call polycrisis. So there's so many multiple crises going on at one time in different ways and forms and their impact that we don't even know. So and the nature of that change of polycrisis or big events that could be adverse, and the frequency of them seems to be increasing with that. And so that's also, I think, a factor. From a systems perspective, I think if anxiety is an excessive anticipation of perceived future threats, then we'll likely start thinking of more if there's a high frequency of them happening now. Also noting that we have more access to information to tell us about them.
Yes.
Which I think is different as well. So that's also a factor. Yes, they're increasing, but also we are hearing about them instantly. And a lot of them, we just do not need to know about certain things that are going on around the world, but we do. From a systems perspective, it's then how do I, if chronic anxiety moves in a system between people, in people, so it spreads the fumes in the room, then it's going to be contagious. And so how we respond to those perceived future threats becomes really important. Will I just sort of breathe in the air of the anxious air because others have it? Or am I able to, this is a real example of how do I manage my thoughts and feelings and anxiety about these big events and perceived threats that are really completely out of my control? And therefore, how do I regulate myself with them? Because if I don't, I'm going to, like many, many other people, my anxiety is going to increase and the impacts of that. So it comes back to how does one self-regulate and deal with those perceived threats and manage our anxiety as a calm, non-anxious presence, or the alternative is go with the flow, as most people are.
So talking about that and how people can control that in their world, we talked about in the last show, but also let's talk about it now. I mean, all these things are happening around us.
Yeah,
they're happening in our family unit, wherever we are. There's all these things that could cause us to be anxious. What should we do? Do we avoid listening to the news?
Do we build a moat around our castle and come out?
Fill up the drawbridge.
and build a basement and fill it with tins of certain things? I don't think so. I think we need to be very, I think talking about this is really important because the anxiety is in the system. It moves between two or more people, families, organizations, societies, nations, and it's highly contagious. So off that premise is our society and the way in which it's spread. So you mentioned social media. Social media is actually it's almost like the means of passing that anxiety on.
Yeah.
Now, it's got lots of good things on it. So again, I'm not being doom and gloom and get rid of social media, phones or whatever, but it is a medium for passing that anxiety on. So it's bearing all that in mind. It comes back to the regulation and differentiation of self, not to be, it's all about me, but how do I take responsibility for myself, being aware of myself, thinking about what I'm thinking about, having some conversations about our perceived anxiety to your question around global events, having some meaningful conversations about how you mentioned how young people feel towards these global events that are going on, and to be able to name and share in a healthy way I think there's a good deal of anxiety that they and we are carrying. If we don't do that, we're going to continue carrying it and sharing it and spreading it. And it almost spirals upwards in terms of its impact. It grows, it exacerbates, it almost swells. And so we can become operating really in a heightened sense of anxiety where it really just is bubbling beneath the surface for people, and then something triggers it. And then we go into, if we think back to our last discussion, we go into reactivity. And that's one of the that's really the first symptom or sign, if you like, of how this all works is how do I operate? What am I like when I am in a reactive mode and I'm fueled or filled by chronic anxiety? Or I will operate and act in a certain way most of the time if I don't stop, regulate myself, go through a process, and that includes naming it and sharing it and a bunch of other things that can really be very helpful to me, but not just to me, to those around me, because the inverse then happens. The system is infected in a healthy way, and the anxiety starts to diffuse, and that the air filled with anxiety fumes there's an air exchange that takes place, and it's filled with clean air, and the anxiety goes out the room, and we can start to be our true selves more than living from this false self, which is fueled by anxiety.
I think we've lifted the lid on that in a good way and say, hey, you're not a stranger in this. You're not alone in this. You're not odd and strange. If you are not coping in some degree and you feel like you've got anxiety, particularly after the last few years, there's a lot of us that would feel that way. And so we're not alone in that. And as men, we certainly shouldn't feel shame if we are feeling that way at times. Let's then talk about the impact that this can have on our family relationships and our workplace organizations, and of course, even our church relationships too. How can we navigate some of those waters if we feel that anxiety is present? Nick, we kind of left it and saying that, there is, I suppose, the first part of the show, that is, we kind of left the first part of the show of saying that there's, I suppose, a general sense when you pull back a bigger picture that community at large and societies at large are generally struggling with a lower level sense of anxiety. And we may be even doing things now that are creating this in our lives. And you talked about social media and those sorts of things. Let's look at some of the impacts of that on then the family system and relationships. Let's start with that, and then maybe come back and have a look at how that's affecting our workplaces. But let's start with the families and our family relationships. And you mentioned in the first show about there being relational anxiety. And I think we can all relate to that, with whether it's wives, kids, in-laws, uncles, etc., that we don't see very often, but there's tension in our family relationships. I suppose, how do we kind of pinpoint what that actually is? Like, we might have sensed that something was off in our families or whatever. How do we actually get to the nuts and bolts of, oh, that's what it is? And if it's not necessarily on us, and it's maybe that there's two of our family members who just don't like each other, and whenever we're in the room, their tension creates tension for everybody else. I mean, there's all sorts of scenarios, but I suppose where do we start with family? That's a tricky one because it's family, right? We can't escape our family at times.
Families are central to a flourishing society, meaningful relationships, and they're also a whole bunch of work, and we don't get to pick each other. And so there are a lot of things. They're beautiful and special and very challenging, and as each of us can be. And so life is the stuff of relationship, and relationships are hard. I'm not saying anything we all don't know, but it's good to be reminded of it. And so I think coming back to systems theory and the work that Bowen and Friedman and others did is, I think, really unpacked a system of thinking that doesn't just help families grow and be better families, but I think can apply to a culture at large. In terms of the family systems, he looked at there were eight things. And so he took the levels of differentiation of self. So how much of my how do we remain our full selves and remain connected? So I'm me and we're connected in together versus a meshing of relationships where we are codependent and you can't tell who's who and everyone just follows one another. And it ends up, quite messy. And so differentiation of self becomes important. Bowen did a lot of work on how this can happen from generation to generation. I mentioned sibling position in the previous show. And also you mentioned about where two people might not get on. And so he sort of coined the term around triangulation. And that can be where and this happens in workplaces, where two people or someone is carrying anxiety. Take gossip, for example. Gossip is always via a triangle, where one person goes to another and triangulates the third person. Think of it that way. Remember back in school, if you remember or had this happen, but someone would give another person a note. Can you go and ask that person to go out with me?
That's that long ago, I can't remember.
Yeah. So triangles happen at an early age. But from a triangulation point of view, it can be a potent force where there's an odd one out.
Yes.
And so this can happen. Sorry.
Or the black sheep.
Yeah. And it can happen in workplaces, happen in families where we might buy a gift or mention a gift that one child got for us and how wonderful it is, and not so much mention it on the other child. And so it can inadvertently create some sort of triangle, or playing favorites, or, as I said, singling somebody out in the workplace who may have slighted or a perceived slight against us, and therefore we'll go to another person and talk about that person to make ourselves feel better and lower our anxiety. The effect that has is then increases the anxiety in the person that we're triangulating.
Yeah.
Right.
And then that forms and grows, and then you have an unhealthy system. And so this takes place all the time in families. It takes place all the time in workplaces. I think now more than ever, how do we be, I think becoming aware of how systems theory works, of how anxiety moves within systems. For example, I've been in workplaces where we just sat down and talked about triangulating and about how anxiety moves and operates and how we're feeling about certain things that might be going on in our family or in our workplace. And that act alone, by just bringing it out into the open, and even being aware of how this moves within systems, is, I've seen it on a number of occasions to be a complete moment for people.
Yeah, just that makes so much sense to me in terms of a family. You know, we got a family that's dysfunctional because of whatever.
Yeah.
You bring them together in a room and say, hey, let's have a conversation about why I'm feeling anxious, why you're feeling anxious, and let's get it all on the table and decide how we as a unit can move forward, would be hugely positive.
Yes, it is. And it's a cornerstone of family therapy.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be in therapy to do things. If you're struggling with this and it is ongoing and you seem like you're in a chronically stuck position,
Yeah.
I would recommend the therapy and family therapy. It's a great thing to do. And of course, I'd say that from my perspective, but it also is a really great thing to do. But you don't have to be in therapy to do this. You can be sitting down and having these healthy conversations, because the nature of families or teams or organizations that get in this position is they tend to focus more on the symptoms or turn their anxiety to the latest issue versus what is causing the anxiety.
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
So you don't address the cause. You actually go around looking for, you don't address the real cause. You go around taking your anxiety to pick up some cause and fight it.
Yes.
But can I just backtrack to that? There will be people listening, and I suppose maybe myself included, which is why I've picked up on it. But there'll be people listening to go, that all sounds wonderful. We sit around at the kitchen table at mum's place and we all air our grievances in a loving, healthy way. And then we all come at the end and we hug and we kiss and we become a family unit again. And it's awesome. That sounds delightful, but that is so far removed from where my family is at right now. And I can't imagine, I mean, we've got, two people in our family that can't even be in the same room without, verbal insults flying, or one of them storming off and slamming a door. Like, I mean, that's an idealistic picture, and I'm not saying it's unrealistic, but for some people, it might be a very far-fetched to even a starting point to fixing what's happening in their family.
Yeah.
If it is the latter, where things are, pretty volatile, people just can't even get to that point. Do you have some recommendations for those sorts of relationships? And it might even be a husband and wife, for example. They might be at a point where there's so much tension and stuff between them. Just being in the same room right now, let alone having a healthy conversation, is an issue.
Yeah, there may well certainly be some symptoms and some outer things that can need to be treated, because this can take place in all sorts. It can manifest in abuse, or it can manifest in just ongoing conflict, 0 to 100, and emotional cutoff, where you just don't talk to that person anymore. Or there's a whole range of things that this can manifest as. If I jump back to Friedman's work in this, and I say this for a reason, because I think it's important, because it leads to a point. He had 5 characteristics of chronically anxious families and systems. 1, reactivity, this vicious cycle of intense reactions to other members or events. 2 is herding, a process which is a force of togetherness triumphs over individuality. So you end up, everyone then seeks to adapt to the least mature member. And this often happens in families, workplaces, and we see it in our culture. Blame displacement. So that's an emotional state in which a family or even a society focuses on the forces that have victimized them, rather than taking responsibility for their own being, our own destiny. So blame. And then this leads to the quick fix mentality. So with a low threshold for pain that constantly seeks symptom relief rather than fundamental change. This all points to that someone is going to have to take a leadership position here, and they're going to need to do work on themselves and lead that system. Otherwise, it will remain the family, 2 people, a family, a team, an organization, a church, or whatever, will remain a stuck system until someone steps up and takes the lead on this. They have to be perfect, but they're going to have to take the lead. Say in the example that you mentioned, where they don't talk anymore. Now, that may also not lead to the whole thing being resolved and hearing Kumbaya playing in the background. That just may not happen. But at least you can move out of that stuck position and start to break this vicious spinning cycle of how chronic anxiety works.
And so painting that in a workplace scenario, then let's jump there. If people can go, well, I'm in a workplace where I feel that there's hurting, or there's, there's someone being left out, or, there's this tension in the room and certain people enter the board meeting or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
What would be a healthy approach with that? Is it to approach somebody directly, or to take a third party as a witness or whatever, or to go through HR? Like what, again, it's hard to paint a scenario because there are so many, but is a one-on-one approach too confronting for some people? Do you think, is it better to try and have an easier, softer approach? What are your thoughts of that? Because the workplaces are tricky, right? I mean, it's like,
workplaces are, and I know we all know, and your listeners will just have situations come to mind where they're really hard. And they can occupy a lot of headspace, and it can generate further anxiety to the point where we might not even be wanting to go back in there.
That's right. But people will leave a job if they feel that the culture or the workplace is unfavorable for them. And yet people will stay in a job even if they don't necessarily like the job, but they love the culture or the people that they work with. So it's important. Yeah.
It is. And I think you have to start with self. Where am I anxious, and how is that playing out? How am I, that number one in out of that 5 is reactivity. Where am I reacting? And what do I look like when I react? So as I mentioned in the previous show, I try to fix more things, get more organized, and have answers to everything, and then a whole bunch of other things. And my inner perfectionist, amplifies. Each of us will have certain characteristics in an anxious state that amplify. So self-regulating, being self-aware, how do I operate when I'm like this, and starting with me, and how can I step forward in my growth and leadership and my growing and moving towards being more of, not perfectly, a non-anxious presence. And that will have an effect in the system as well. If it's a safe place and there are people you can talk to, I think that is a good way to do it. Being very aware of how if you're in a situation like this at work, there will be triangulation happening, I guarantee it. And so diffusing and breaking down those triangles, or at least not being part of them, or if somebody tries to triangulate you or bring you into one, you can, in a healthy way, not engage with that, and in a sense, break the triangle in a good way. Yeah, depending on the level of it and whether it can be escalated, if you are in a position of no leadership, some leadership, or in a senior leadership position, will depend on how much influence you have in the organization. But I would just say, speaking from experience, is whatever the hierarchical position you're in your workplace, if you're self-employed or in a team or a corporate or whatever, the impact that you can have by changing in this way starts to, and I'll use that language again I mentioned, it starts to infect the system in a healthy way, and that clean air comes into the room, and that can make a really big difference, because people will see that your presence is a really important word, your calmness, you become a safe place for people, and that starts to change the game, and that's a beautiful thing. And I would just encourage people, if they're in that place, now that of course goes, if you know you're in an intractable situation, it's a toxic culture, there's narcissists and bullies on the loose, think about whether that's the place for you to stay.
Yes.
So I just put that caveat there, but it's a beautiful thing as someone puts this into practice, the impact and witness that you can have on other people.
Yeah. Can I bounce off the back of that, because we're pretty much out of time, but just to bounce off the back of that and say, if you need a confidential conversation outside of the workplace or the family, and you don't have somebody in your world that you can do that with, I'm going to point you to the Momentum CARELINE again. That's 1-800-000-636, 1-800-000-636. You can have a absolutely confidential conversation about anything that's happening in your world, whether it is workplace, family, anxiety, or anything else related. Because the truth is, sometimes just having a conversation can help you see things in a different light, or bring a different perspective, or just get things off your chest in a safe place. And then you come back with a different attitude and breathing different air, as Nick has said before. I think we're pretty much out of time this week, show, Nick. We've got a couple of other things that we'd love to have talked to you, but maybe we'll get you back on the show and do that in a later stage. But I just want to say, on behalf of Des and myself and the guys listening, man, that there's been a lot in the last couple of weeks about anxiety, and you've certainly brought a lot of different perspectives and a different light, stuff that I would never have thought about. So thank you.
Yes.
And again, if you'd like to hear this show again, momentumaustralia.org, or check out the podcast at simply put in Momentum Australia in your Spotify, your Apple, however you listen to your podcasts. And I'm going to point you to the AIFC website, of course, aifc.com.au. They have a bunch of resources. And of course, their Cancel Culture podcast, which you can listen to as well, where they explore things in depth as well. But the CEO of AIFC, Nick Marks, has been our special guest the last few weeks. An impacting couple of weeks, Nick. We really appreciate it, mate. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Des.
Our pleasure.
Thank you for watching this week's show, and we hope you subscribe to Momentum so you can find out what's happening in the shows in the future.
Absolutely. And keep an eye on our website too. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find all of our shows and a whole heap of resources to help you on your journey. That is momentumaustralia.org.
Until next time, keep moving forward
with Momentum.